Hi, it's Erica, and you're about to tune into a conversation between myself and Heng Ou, chef and author of The First 40 Days.
Hi, Han.
Hi, Erica. It's so nice to be here with you.
It's extra special sweet for me to have you because I think you and I have been on a very long journey together, kind of witnessing each other's careers and expansion and change and loss and growth. And so I just am really excited to mind meld with you a little bit around one of our mutual passions, which is food.
Mhm.
And trying to think about how new moms and partners and family of new moms can support themselves, around food. But also, I'm actually the most curious just to hear about your food philosophy because I think it does come through in your books, but, I think there's a softness and a gentleness that you bring to just the process of putting food into the body that I think is so beautiful, and I'm really excited to unpack that. But before we do, I have to ask you the question that I ask every guest that I've had join me for this audio series. And that question is, what's the first thing you remember learning about your body and how it worked?
Great question. I think there have been several chapters of that evolution in the past. I think, like, I would say 17 years since I think the awakening of the first conception of my first child. So, up until then, I was sort of in this module, kind of like moving around in space or along in the ocean, kind of like finding my way and like bopping into things and corals and things and that. So I wasn't so self-aware until sort of like the internal, sort of like just like ping kind of came in as the first little like inkling of like, wow, I've actually conceived a baby, and I think just having that sort of like internal voice of curiosity, of looking inwards, of really interested in like the science of the cells and how it all came together and all the formation of forming this baby. It really kind of like internally made me draw back inwards to be like, wow, I'm actually doing this myself along with this child, and that's really fascinating. I think that's like the first initial internal voice and language that had started. It's not just like a one time, experience. I think this is it's an ongoing, and it would always be ongoing, which is I'm so happy for. Like finally, I'm giving myself the permission to have this language with my own body.
Yeah, and I think it's really beautiful that when I asked you the question in terms of this idea of the first thing you remember learning, everyone takes this question in a different direction. But I love that you took it to when you were pregnant for the first time, there was this like unlock or this awareness because I think this idea of first is elastic. And the memory of the body is also elastic. And so I just love your answer. And it's so fitting, especially for anybody that's pregnant listening to this, that this pregnancy experience, especially if it's for the first time, is a deep learning curve and opportunity. And so there might be things you're learning about your body for the first time in this process, even if you have learned things in the past. So I just think that's really beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's a trip, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's all a trip. It's wild. Thinking about things that are wild, and when I say wild, I mean wild not in the sense of crazy or all over the place, but more wild in the sense of something that's untamed and is getting the chance to get light and water and nutrients and grow without any interruption. I'd love to have you share a little bit about your background and how you started working in postpartum healing and in postpartum foods, because I think that story is really interesting.
Yeah, there's several ways of that I experienced in my life to kind of get me to the place of establishing mother bees. As I think most creators these days, we go back to what we know the best as a child, or how we grew up. And in my culture, which is like the Chinese culture, I grew up with my aunts and uncles who are acupuncturists up in Oakland, California. So I've always sort of like just like been bopping around in their offices, going up and down. They have three different offices within one building, three different practices, and it's still the same decor, for the last 30 years. But, I've always been so, in admiration of them, and I would always pop in and listen to their conversations, and they're not great in speaking English, but they can get the work done, and that's always so surprising to me, is that, they healed so many people, and one of my aunts specialized in helping couples conceive. So, I've always been around the language and also been around the understanding of functional food as medicine, right? So whatever we eat, there's always a function, there's always a purpose, there's always like, even though if it was a little bit bitter, we knew that, we needed that bitter taste to balance out the sweetness and the sour and the salt and the oil. So it was like encompassing full balance approach to how we consume food. So, I think that was like ingrained in my, as you say, like muscle memory. And I've always been intrigued by, just looking at food and how that related to my body, and also how I started to look into what my intuition was like, and how I've been enhancing it throughout the years now, and intuitively feeling out what food feels for me. And I think it's all part of the whole ecosystem of how, I grew up with my family, and, the grandmothers who would, just always talk to their food and always say like, the goji berry is good for my eyes, like we're eating liver, to help the kidneys. I mean, it's always some association to some organ part, which is so cool. Yeah.
Well, I love this idea of talking to food and this idea that the perceivably inanimate is actually animate. I, as you know, have a culinary background, and I have always had a very special relationship to food, really feeling, even when it's no longer living, that it still has a soul and it has a, as you described, like a purpose. And I think that's such an important mindset to invite postpartum people into, in the sense that even if you can't have time, or even if you don't have time to make, a real meal, like pick the best possible things that you can to graze or just, throw in your mouth. But just know that each thing that you're eating and interacting with has a quality. And so just trying to pick the best quality thing or highest frequency thing to place in your body. And that could be as simple as like a piece of fruit that's affordable for you, or just making sure you're drinking enough water, and that you're keeping your body warm with like warm teas. And so I just love that concept of the food has a purpose. So carrying on with the journey component of how you landed in postpartum healing, it's understood that you kind of came from that in terms of your lineage. But what was the event or the moment that made you feel that Mother Bees was it, and that postpartum healing is what you really wanted to do? And also, at what point did it feel very clear that it needed to incorporate this concept of the 40 days that also comes from your lineage?
Yeah. So, the first birth that I experienced, I had my aunts come down from Oakland, and they, cooked for me and stocked my freezer. And I barely lifted a finger for the first few weeks. And also, it was such a new experience that, we were just making stuff up left and right. My husband and I, we didn't know what we were doing, in terms of swaddling. I mean, all these terms that, I think a lot of women and new parents are more experienced now. When I gave birth 17 years ago, it was I felt like we were pretty much on our own, even though we had a doula and a midwife. But when we were back at home, it was on our own. So it was just our own discovery. But yet, I had my aunts close by, and again, our fridge and our freezers were filled with all this delicious, Chinese food to kind of get us through. But then the second birth, I went straight back into my office, which was in my studio, in the garage, and I think I went in within like the first week. And I thought that, I could just swaddle my baby, like like I could just like hold her along the way and breastfeed and work as well. So I felt like, you know what, I got this. I can really handle this. And then I got pregnant a couple years later. So I had 3 babies and within 5 years. So the last baby, I got really sick 1 month before I gave birth to my son. And I was in bed for about a month, and then I gave birth, at home. And then it all really fell apart. My postpartum, I actually had, lose or depression, however way we want to label it. But I was absent for the good first couple months after he was born, even though that was the easiest birth. I had everything in place. I had nannies for my other 2 toddlers. I felt settled in a physical state, but yet my internal state and flame was completely gone. So it wasn't until my midwife came for her second home visit that she noticed that something was missing and something wasn't right in me. I got through it, but also at the end of the postpartum, my marriage then fell apart. So that was a big shakeup in terms of postpartum health, or having 3 babies in so little time.
Just to touch in a little bit more about just the idea of the sitting in and the first 40 days, which is the title of your first book, if you could just kind of simply explain what that is and why you would recommend it, regardless of what lineage, ethnicity, or kind of culture someone comes from.
Yeah. So me, on my personal, experience after birth, I did feel tremendous turn in my physical state on and around the 6 week mark. So 40 days is around 6 weeks. And I felt like, oh my gosh, like this was like a black and white experience. So I knew that for the first 6 weeks after birth, there's a lot of just sweating, bleeding, figuring out breastfeeding, like all sorts of ups and downs. And it's all sort of like just like meshed into the first few weeks. As I sort of like really experienced that for myself, I start to do more research and learning, and then the traveling started, and then asking around to other aunties and grandmothers around on my travels. And everybody would start saying things like, oh no, this is like a way of life. We don't separate, pregnancy to birth to postpartum. Like we all are all part of this new mother's experience. And we don't ever want to leave her side. That kind of like made a big statement for me to understand, like, okay, the first 40 days, the first 6 weeks, the first, and we all know that, this doesn't end at 40 days, it doesn't end at 6 weeks. This can go on for a year to 2 years, and possibly beyond. This is just like a general timescape that I've landed on. And I wanted to also focus the sort of like the emergency kind of like quote unquote state of how important it is for the mother to nurture herself at this time or be nurtured. Because also, the traditional Chinese medicine, if we can give a quick little outlook on that, is that we see that as like an open state, right? So we want to like close it all up and bring it all back inwards, so the organs for the placenta, like everything, start to like kind of come back inwards. So we kind of see that as a concept. We want the warmth, the comfort, the easeability of the mom to kind of like retract a bit, but not be in a lonely state, but just for her body to kind of just sink in to what the newness of what her new role is. So there's a lot of beauty, I think, and there's a lot of like poetic parts to this component, which I really love. And it's complex too.
Yeah, there's definitely the complexity because a lot of that transition into postpartum is very hard, but then at the same time, there is so much wonder and beauty in the sense of you just made a person, and that person is, gently revealing themselves to you. And as you get more adept at doing the things that you need to do now as a parent or a mother, whether that's feeding or just knowing how to change your baby's diaper or being able to soothe your baby to sleep, these are firsts. So there's a lot of wonder, and then there's a lot of complexity and challenge kind of all built into that. So I think it's just so important to kind of acknowledge, all of those different parts of the experience. Thinking about the different parts, let's like skip over to the kitchen because this is really where I wanted to spend some time with you and really just think about that space. And so I'd love to hear what are three things that you feel are kind of non-negotiable in a postpartum kitchen, in the sense of maybe one thing that's in the fridge, something that's in the freezer, and something that's in like the pantry or kind of dry stall.
My go-to is to have an ample supply of broths and bone broths in the freezer. This can be done, a month before you give birth. I love having the bone broths, and I always like whenever I visit a new mom, I always feel like, okay, as long as I have my broths, I have my ingredients to make a stew, and maybe like a fun little treat for her, just to kind of bring her spirits up, or just to kind of bring her a little bit of happiness if that's needed, or just to bring some joy. So the bone broths I love. I think that's the foundation.
And in terms of bone broths, what kind of bone broth would you recommend?
The easy go-to one is obviously the chicken with a lot of roasted chicken feet because that gives a lot of collagen. My second, favorite would be like a beef bone knuckle broth with the because like when you cook the broth and you have it in your freezer, you can then pull that out, and like the next day when it's defrosted, you can cook it with some seaweed, and then you have like a meal, and that like bone broths and seaweed, a stew, and soup is really great. If you really need some extra protein, then you can add an egg in there. So I like to keep it really simple. Like, I don't want to overcomplicate it. Really, I'm a very simple, like, cook. I don't need to like overthink what our bodies need, especially during that time. So, as long as we have our healthy fats, and I completely understand if, one is, just eats plant food, or as a vegetarian or vegan.
And would you recommend like a seaweed soup or broth for someone that's vegan or vegetarian?
I would, I do. I think, women who are vegetarian and vegan, they just have to, eat a little bit, not only more, but they have to just eat, like, let's say, like, more avocados, or more, like, fatty, foods. I mean, they need the substance of of healthy fats. And adding a little bit more, ghee if they're okay with ghee. I mean, I feel like at the time after birth, I feel like there's gotta be a little bit more of just an open, like, sort of like palate to the healthy fats. Because we have to understand, like, healthy fats can then help with breastfeeding and with, circulation and with energy. So if it's not coming from the meat with animal protein, then it's gotta come from, plant, which, they just need to consume a little bit more and more variety of.
To get the same, nutritional profile. Yeah, I hear that. And so bone broth, chicken with chicken feet or beef, add some seaweed in the next day, or do a seaweed broth if you're vegan or vegetarian. So how are we snacking? Like, what are some of your favorite snacks?
Yeah, you know what? I do love the. So first, we always have to have a good foundation of of warm and hot water. I love that as like just like have that at the bedside, having a constant a pitcher of room temperature water if you're not into drinking hot water. I drink hot water all day long, especially when I get my period or when it's cold outside. So that's all I drink. I don't drink any cold water. So because I also understand that with cold water, it does make my body chilled inside, and also I can see my body sort of like tightening inside, right? And I can feel that. So with the state of the new mom, I always feel like it's always room temperature water or hot. So that's constant. And then you have the possible herbal teas, and then you have, let's say if you're making like an oats tea. It's gonna be a little satiating, so it's not like you're just drinking water. And then you have, so this is like I'm kind of like adding layers on top of what, like the bottom foundation to up towards like the pyramid. So then like if one's into nuts, they can soak their nuts the night before, so you have soaked nuts by your bedside. I think that's really great. And then you have little I'm a humongous, fan of avocados. So, as simple as that, just like, avocados, cut in cubes with a little salt and pepper and lemon. And you just chomp on that. And there you I think with avocado with like fresh avocados, and you have the ample, fats, and you have, just like the satiating, snack. Because at that time we were not going into really too many cold ingredients or too many salady things. We want to keep it not just the room temperature and hot temperature of the food. We want to sort of like stay with like foods that are going to keep our bodies at a good heated environment. So it's nuts, avocados, and then we have, the nutritional yeast, and we have, the sesame seeds and little sprinkles of those on top. Because, and I always like to sort of like have that in the pantry ready, or even have that at your bedside, just so you can just sort of like take a little, handful and put a little nutritional yeast on. It could be like it could be your nuts, or you can just take a little spoonful of it, and also rice congee has been in our tradition for a long time.
especially when it's basically porridge.
It's porridge, right? So, and I've seen my aunts make rice porridge with oatmeal. So they would
Mhm,
mix the
mhm.
2, right? So it's nice to see that, because you just have a little bit more substance, and then you can put anything on top of it, and you can cook these things like once or twice a week, and you'll have it. I don't think new moms really need too much like crazy variety, so it doesn't have to be sort of like over thought of. But I think if you have like the foundation of the liquids, the warm liquids, and then you can move into the soups and the stews, because I love having those and portioned out in the freezer. Because whenever I go into your mom's house, it's always like I always like to kind of like get like a pork butt, with some fat, and I go there and cut it up with like the kabocha squash and a little bit of onions, and then the like the red lentils and the coconut oil, and I like to like just like have that brewing on the stove, and then I leave, and then she'll have that like a couple hours later, and then also she'll have that for for a couple days. And I love the idea of the stew on the stove and leaving them with it.
Yeah, I love stew on the stove and rice congee and, all of these little pieces of just like, dust some sesame seeds on top of something if you are a sesame seed person. There's just like very easy, gentle ways to, make sure that you're getting kind of what you need. And I think this idea of having things by the bedside is so key. I always have been really forthright around like snacks by the bedside or snacks wherever you're going to be feeding the baby, whether you're breastfeeding or body feeding, and just kind of remembering kind of when the baby eats, you should eat something. So the more that these kind of pre-portioned things are around, whether it's in the freezer or the fridge or in your living room, it's going to be really helpful for you. Um, what are your thoughts about Instapots? I finally broke down, and got and got one, and I really love it. It's a really fun tool. As someone who went to culinary school, I like kind of like poo-pooed Instapots. I was like, "Oh, who needs that?" But like I think in this new time where there actually is not enough time, I made a khichdi, which essentially is an Indian version of congee, a couple days ago, and it took like 15 minutes to cook, and it was porridge consistency, and I was like, "Okay, I get this. I understand, why this is helpful." But what are your thoughts around Instapot versus slow cooking and like, minerals and like the ritual of it postpartum?
Yeah, I had an Instapot and it broke on me, unfortunately. So I haven't had the great pleasures of it, but, like, I remember when I had it, it was like, "Wow, I can't believe this just happened, and I just cooked this for such little time." But, I have a slow cooker and, it's a bigger in quart size, and, I'm constantly running that thing, and, like the Instapot, I think they're both great, in terms of kinda like just, like, throwing what you have in the fridge together. Because really at the end of the day, you can't go too wrong, in terms of if you think about, your protein source, your fiber source, your vitamins, your minerals, like if you have all those components and if you put it into a pot of some sort and cook it for a couple hours, you're gonna have a satiating, a meal. This is kind of like the way to go, especially after birth, because I'm never gonna suggest, anything raw. I mean, it's hard to say this, but like, that's not just it's just not in the tradition to eat anything raw or cold. Well, what's the opposite is
Yeah, I'm aligned with that. I think really even if you just think about it from a physiological, let's even pull back from there. If you just think about it from the perspective of what your body is doing in those first, few weeks of postpartum healing, you want foods that are going to move through your body really easily, and foods that are warm and foods that are cooked don't require as much stomach acid, don't require as much peristalsis, which means the movement of the gut. It kind of just can get from A to B to C pretty easily. I'm with you in that, like, warm cooked foods are just going to be gentler on your body. I think people sometimes forget how intense like raw digestion is on the system. It's like it's very active too, and you're already doing so much stuff with the baby and with the healing. And so you want your digestion to be a little bit more passive. And so warm and cooked food allows you to experience that.
Yeah, absolutely. And and having miso, or having ginger and the jujubes on hand, I think are like the sort of like essentials knowing that you have that. It's easy to if you're sort of like really, in the bind, you can make a quick miso soup, right? Like, and then you will, have the great ferments and, and if you really, can maybe throw an egg in, and maybe throw in some seaweed, or maybe throw in some watercress or spinach. So, and sprinkle some lemon juice on it, so again, it's like, it doesn't have to be too complicated, but I think once you're kind of like well stocked in your postpartum pantry, in the fridge, freezer, and dry storage, then you have that in hand, and you'll have that for for the first month or so. Again, it doesn't have to be so of a challenge.
I think that's so important for anyone who's listening to hear is that it doesn't have to be that much of a challenge. And I also want to touch back on something you said a few moments ago of this idea that there doesn't need to be that much variety either. I think that that's so key. I think that's key regardless of whether you are pregnant, postpartum, parenting, just for a person that eats, like really finding your simple roster of foods and just continuing to eat them all the time. I think the variation of food is actually a point of stress. And just understanding that it's okay to like five things and just always kind of make those five things and just keep improving on those five things. So, miso soup, bone broth, avocado toast, or a roast chicken, these are fine. Sometimes like cookbooks can make you feel like, oh, I've got to try all these different things. I think even with your book, The First 40 Days, which I adore, and I wonder if you would feel similarly with this recommendation. Like, you don't have to cook everything that's in the book. Just like pick the things that
Yeah.
you really love and just like stick with those.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I don't expect everyone to cook everything up from the books because it's quite a bit. You know what? And also, I'm a big believer in having the individual trust their own body, what their body needs. I like to create the recipes to give as suggestions, but I always like to teach them to go within their own bodies and to believe and trust themselves the best that they can. And if they want to omit an ingredient, then they can omit an ingredient. Obviously, they can exchange things. They can change things out depending on the budget and also availability of the products around them. So I don't want to be like this is the way it is or else kind of person as an author and also recipe developer. I really, love having the joy around food too. So I love having the sort of like the 90% healthy food and 10% just like fun food, because it's got to be joyful. And, again, doesn't have to be a huge roster. We often tend to go back to our habits, right? What we're habitually used to eating, and also where we are locally. And as you touched upon earlier, is that when we start to kind of go into more of the carby, sweeter stuff, or it's more with like emotional eating and like some stressors that's like pulling that in. So there's a lot of sort of like questions to ask, but also maybe postpartum really isn't the time to sort of ask yourself all these questions, right? It's That's why I like the idea of prepping yourself before you give birth. To really get to know yourself and work out a lot of the like the bigger picture language and the questions and answers before you go into birth, and then you can settle in into postpartum.
Yeah, well, I think that is beautiful advice, and so much of this conversation has really been soothing and hopefully inspiring for folks out there to just start thinking about food postpartum and know that it can be simple and that planning ahead is really going to be supportive. Repetition is totally okay, and to try and find the joy in eating simply, and how much that joy can kind of spill out into other things. Well, Han, thank you for taking the time. Appreciate you always. Just sending you a lot of love and ease in this wild paradigm we are just unfolding into.
Yeah, thanks you, Erica. It's so nice to hear your voice and speak with you, and also seeing you along your journey. And I'm always admiring you from now, I guess, from a different city, but I'm always here.
Well, thank you, and give my love to the kids, and, we'll talk soon.
Very good. I will. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay,
Okay,
bye.
bye.